Hey, welcome to the Awakening Report. I'm your host, Doug Hamp. Glad to be with you guys. I have a very special guest waiting in the wings. I'm really excited about having Dr. Michael Heiser with us, and he is going to share his insights. And so we're glad to have you, Dr. Heiser. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, we started a little bit late because we got messed up on Mountain versus Pacific time. So it's really great to have you. And I know that you do a lot of interviews, and so we will try to give you a few easy questions, maybe a few challenging ones.
Right.
And part of what we're doing is we're discussing the word, and none of us has it all right. None of us has all the answers, and we're trying to understand what God's word is saying. And so I appreciate a few challenging questions. I might throw a few ones at you. I'm sure you can handle them just fine. And I may or may not agree. And that's just part of scholarship, is we never completely agree with ourselves. And I don't know about you, but I don't even agree with me from some years ago. So I'm still learning. Yeah. And we do have some people in the chat room, and so we will be taking their questions as they come in. So let's get started. Kind of, you've spent a lot of time writing. You're a very accomplished author. Kind of give us a little rundown on where you studied. I know you studied in Wisconsin, and your basic studies.
Yeah, I started at a Bible college. I went to it's no longer in existence. It was called Pillsbury. So my first faith tradition was fundamental Baptist. I wasn't raised in a Christian home. I became a Christian as a teenager, and that's where my pastor recommended me to go to Bible college. I could really entertain your audience with how inept my whole journey has been. I mean, I had no direction at all. Nobody in my family had gone to college. It's just one of those kind of stories. But so I eventually just literally went to my pastor and said, "Hey, I'm getting out of high school, and what should I do?" So I wound up at this Bible college, which I really enjoyed. As little Bible colleges do, it imploded after 3 years. Like 80% of the faculty resigned over something. I can't even remember what it was. Mm-hmm. And then I wound up going to Bob Jones for a year and a half in South Carolina, because they're the only ones that would take my credits, which I also enjoyed that. I chafed under some of the rules, and some of the, I guess we could call them little oddities of the place, but it was very academically challenging. So I could have had a free ride there. They offered me a free ride all the way up through the PhD, and I said no, which kind of shocked them. I just thought it was too inbred, and I was told by people I really respected to not do that. So I went to a couple seminaries, bounced back and forth to seminary. Didn't get any degree. I got married in the middle of all that. Wound up going to grad school back in my home state of Pennsylvania at Penn, and got a master's degree there. Then I went off into teaching for a little while, and then I wound up eventually going to Wisconsin, where we were there 9 years. So I had a master's and a PhD in Hebrew Bible and Semitic languages at the University of Wisconsin. So that is academically where I've been like in fundamentalism all the way to UW-Madison is like the Berkeley of the Midwest, the Berserkly of the Midwest, and it deserves its reputation. So everything in between, but I just believe that I had a sense that every place I went, I wanted it to be harder, and I wanted it to be more antagonistic to my faith, because I had this naive, and I think again the Lord was protecting me, but I had this naive idea that I'll bet the questions that people raise at these places have been asked before. Mm-hmm. I'll bet good scholars have thought about them before, and the scripture's still here. So chances are really high that when the dust clears, the scriptures will still be what they are. Mm-hmm. And, the Lord will help me figure this out. So there's very little about my path that I recommend to others, because it was just so convoluted. But at the end of the day, the Lord was in all these things, and I wouldn't trade it really for anything. I had to work my way through school full time. So I spent 15 years altogether in graduate school working full time.
Wow.
But you do what you have to do, and
Mm-hmm.
I was of the philosophy you can do anything for a short amount of time.
Sure.
Just break it up, you work the plan, and you just trust the Lord that he'll do something with it.
That's very cool. What has been your maybe you're not most challenging, but one of the most challenging things that you've faced as a scholar? Some of the things that you didn't expect to find, maybe. What were the unexpected realities of choosing this path of being a Bible scholar?
Yeah, well, choosing would be,
Falling into it.
right. I would love to say that, man, I just had this figured out and I'm just so smart. I had all these insights and look at me. But the
Right.
reality is, this is a story. What I know, I was shown. I can just say that with complete confidence. If I contribute anything, to biblical theology, it's not because I was especially smart. It's just I was shown things providentially.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't expect that. I really didn't know what to expect at any number of points. I think, academically, I certainly didn't expect to run into Psalm 82, which was a life-changing conversation at the UW-Madison.
Mm-hmm.
I expected it to be hard. I did not expect graduate school to be a ritual hazing, which it's not supposed to be, but my program was.
Okay.
So it was a chess match the whole way, especially since I was working full time, which you're not supposed to do. So I had to keep that secret, and just any number of things. But I knew it would be hard. I just believed that the Lord would do something with it. So
That's
here we are.
fantastic. On the topic of Psalm 82, somebody was requesting me to watch some video that was denouncing your Psalm 82 idea.
I'm sure that's not the only one that lives on the internet somewhere.
That's par for the course, right?
Yep. It is.
And again, I think we're all discovering things, but some of the suggestions were that the word Elohim never could be used to speak of angels. That it's so, I don't know, just if you can this Psalm 82 idea. Obviously, you've spent a lot of work in it. I know you can't summarize it in 5 minutes, but what piqued your interest when you were at University of Madison that got you to focus on this topic?
What we would loosely call angelology and demonology is the last thing in the world I thought I'd be doing. This is not an exaggeration, but throughout all my Bible college, undergrad, and 2 years of seminary, again, I'm not exaggerating, we spent 1 hour, one class hour on all of it. So I just assigned it to the periphery, like, well, if it was more important, we'd be spending more time on it. So who cares, in fairness to I'll be as generous as I can with the person that you were alluding to with that question. Technically, it's true. Elohim is never used in tandem with Malachim, the angels in the Hebrew Bible. But if you understand what an Elohim is, all angels are Elohim. Elohim is just a spirit being, and an angel is not an ontological term. It doesn't tell you what a thing is. It tells you what a thing does. It tells you what a particular member of the heavenly host does. It's a job description. But setting that aside, I never expected, I wasn't interested in any of this stuff. It just, I was sitting there in church, like I describe in my book, The Unseen Realm. This is the way the book opens. Mm-hmm. And sitting there with another friend of mine in church who was in the Hebrew department. And I do not remember what the discussion was about, but I will never forget the way it ended because it was life-changing. And he had his Hebrew Bible with him. And he said, look, you need to read Psalm 82 in Hebrew. And I did. It's not difficult. Elohim Nitzah Ba'adat El. Elohim, capital G, God. We know that because Nitzah was a singular participle. So the grammar tells you it's one. Elohim takes his stand or stands in the divine council or divine assembly. And then the next line is Bekerav Elohim Yishpot, in the midst of the Elohim, in the midst of the gods. It's not singular there. Mm-hmm. The grammar just tells you that in the midst of the gods, he passes judgment. And I looked at that and I thought, boy, that looks like a pantheon. How in the world could I not only, I knew why I had never seen it before because I never bothered to read any of the Psalms in Hebrew. I was doing other stuff. Typically you do narrative.
Mm-hmm.
But the more disturbing question was, how in the world did I get to this point? I mean, I wasn't a newbie. I had taught 15, 20 classes. I had two master's degrees at this point. I'm in a doctoral program. I'm not a newbie. How could I get this far and never encounter this in anything? And it was like, holy cow, what is going on here? And I don't remember any of the sermon, obviously, that followed. Whatever.
Right.
I mean, this became something I couldn't let go. I had to solve this, and once I tried looking at evangelical scholars. This is back in the 90s. And the ones that you could actually find that mentioned it in a commentary, which wasn't that often, they quite honestly weren't any help. These are the judges of Israel. These are men. These are idols. And it's like I had already known enough to go over to Psalm 89, and they're the councils in the skies, like a bunch of Jewish guys ruling it from the sky. Like this doesn't make any sense. Like idols work for God. Like how is that? It just does. It just made no sense at all. And then when you go to the critical scholarship side, they loved Psalm 82. Because Psalm 82 was one of 2 or 3 passages that allowed them very easily in their own heads to argue that the biblical writers had evolved in their thinking from polytheism to monotheism, which didn't make a whole lot of sense for other reasons. And so this actually became the focus of my dissertation. And to my department's credit, to my advisor's credit, he's a Jewish guy, critical scholar. I don't know where he'd be on the fence as far as, he went to synagogue, most weeks. But he let me do it. He let me do it knowing that I was running contrary to the whole field of critical biblical scholarship with this. But I had enough of a persuasive argument at the beginning that questions were not answered by this model that he let me do it. And so, again, providentially, I had the right person at the right time that was tolerant enough to let me do that. And it just changed everything. It changed my whole perspective of just what's going on in Scripture. And it wasn't that, novelty must be right. It wasn't novelty. It was that if you look at the Scriptures this way, there are a whole lot of other passages that just make sense. And that was important to me because I don't think that the best interpretation for any passage is one that works. I think the best interpretation for any given passage is the one that works in the passage, and it works in the 5 or 6 other passages that this passage touches. In other words, I want comprehensive coherence.
Yeah.
So I don't care if you have a nice view of something. If your view doesn't work at other places, then it can't be the right answer.
Go a little deeper into that, because I often get this question of, Doug, how do you decide to interpret? What's your method of hermeneutics? So, I've shared my idea. Well, I'd love to hear how you deal with this when you look at a text.
I don't have a checklist method. What I typically do is I want to know, first of all, these are just the fundamental questions to me in any, the order doesn't matter. Do other biblical writers repurpose this passage? And how would we know? Well, it's not just that, here's the same word I find here in some other passage. When you get clusters of vocabulary, then that's a little more important. Then we start to see patterning.
Right.
So I'm looking for that. I'm looking for, what does the Septuagint say? Are there any good text critical issues? And more importantly, how does the New Testament, using either the Septuagint or, presumably the Masoretic text at some point, even though they're writing in Greek, how do they repurpose the passage? So I'm always looking for intertextuality. I'm looking for how ancient people thought about the text, because they're closer to the original context than I am and that any Christian tradition is. I want to look for clustering. Patterns are important. Patterns are more important than word studies. Literary analysis gets into this. What is the structure? What's the framework of what's going on here? Because any discussion needs a framework. It has to be framed in the right way. So, all of these things are really important to me. Again, intertextuality, how Scripture is repurposed by other scriptures, and so on and so forth. Those are the out of the gate steps. This is why I typically, when I do research, I start with scholarly journals and dissertations, because I'm fundamentally lazy as well. No, I'm actually not. I'm pretty industrious, but a good journal article and a good dissertation will do tons of work for you.
Mm-hmm.
If they're done well, they should put on the table everything you need to think about,
Mm-hmm.
and what the questions have been and what people have thought up to this point.
Mm-hmm.
So it just saves you a lot of work. So that's kind of how I approach things. I might get to a commentary at some point, but I really try to digest the text in context. And that's my, if I have a banner, that's what it is. In Unseen Realm, this is very evident in the first couple chapters. And I tell people in interviews, look, what I do is, it's not rocket science. It's not magic.
Right.
I want the Israelite living in your head when you read the Old Testament. I want the first century Jew living in your head when you read the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
The right context for interpreting Scripture is the context that, under God's providence, produced the thing. It's not church fathers that come centuries later. Most of those guys don't even know Hebrew.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the Catholic Church. It's not the rabbis. They're medieval. I mean, it's not these things that we typically default to. It's not that they don't make contributions, because they do, but they should never be viewed as sort of the beginning point, or this is the magic answer chest. I'm going to open this thing up and there all the answers are. No, you have to really stick to primary sources and how the biblical writer, what he would have been thinking, because he's writing to people that lived at the same time. Mm-hmm. There's what's the original writer and the original audience, the original receptors of this material. How are they thinking about this?
Yeah.
And that's hard. When I realized that this is what I have to do, it was scary, because it's like, I know if I go down this road, if I cross this Rubicon, I'm going to lose friends. I'll probably be ineligible for jobs. Will anyone ever look at me, in the pastorate, because I'm just not, I don't care about perpetuating a Christian subculture. It's not that they're bad. I mean, they're good. Creeds are good. Christian denominations, I don't have an axe to grind against any of these things, so long as they're in accordance with, the core items of the faith. It's just that this is what church sort of is. It's really about perpetuating subcultures, and I just have no interest in doing that. I want people interested in the text, not their tradition, not their creed, not me. I mean, I want to sort of model what I hope you do or learn to do. You can do it. I'm proof you can do it. I'm just when you get degrees, people don't realize, really what you are. You are the result of cumulative effect. 5 minutes a day, 10 minutes a day, half an hour a day, every day. This is what makes you you. It's just, it's determination, it's steadfastness. I've met geniuses, and I'm not one of them. Okay, I know what a genius looks like. I mean, seriously, I've met a few people that I know go in that category. I'm not one of them. I'm a grunt. I do grunt work, and I'm a sifter. I connect dots. This is how my mind works, and I basically just try to do my job. I've been gifted in certain ways, and I have things laid before me. So I'm looking around. What can I get done for the kingdom of God? And well, that's a good idea. Let's do that. And then the Lord, just thinking that the Lord will open something else up. If this is stupid, He'll make that clear. Mm-hmm. He's perfectly capable of getting in my way, and do this over here. It's just better. I actually believe God does that.
Yeah. We got two questions. I have a question for you too, but I want to get to some people in our chat room first. This is from Brilliant Radiance. This person asks, is the NIV Bible as bad as they say? Walter Veith said it was edited by Jesuits. So, I've heard these theories. So what's your take on that?
Well, you can take the Jesuit thing off the table. That's a little silly. It depends which NIV, because you've got the original NIV, you've got a 1980 something revision, you've got the TNLV, and you've got today's NIV. There's like 4 NIVs. Okay, so putting that on the table and realizing that, there's more than one of these. The two fundamental questions to ask are, or not to ask, but to think about, is what is the NIV's translation philosophy? And then in today's culture, is there a problem with gender neutrality? Those seem to be still the two issues. There are two approaches to translation. One is what we call formal equivalence, where the goal of the translator is to try to account for every word of the text of origin, Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek in this case, and create a corresponding English word for that word. So its form, its equivalence in form. We have to account for every word as much as possible without being ridiculous. Or is dynamic equivalence the goal? And that is, you look at the words in the original, you figure out what they mean, and then you use any words you want in English to convey the same meaning. And in my view is that there's a good place for both of those. And sometimes one is going to work better than the other. I favor formal equivalence because I think it's a good thing to create a translation that leaves ambiguity in the translation where you find it in the text. In other words, translators should try to not interpret when they translate. So I favor that.
Explain between interpretation and translation, because some people don't know the difference between those.
Well, a good example is 1 Corinthians 7:1, where literally, it is good for a man to not touch a woman. Okay? I think it is the NIV that has something like, it's good for a man not to get married. Now, you can look at the phrase, it's good for a man not to touch a woman, and there's some sexual stuff in the context of 1 Corinthians 7, and you can interpret touching to mean sexual relations or marital relations. That's possible. That's legitimately possible. But I don't think you should land on an interpretation and reflect the interpretation in your translation. Let it say what it says. It's good for a man not to touch a woman. And then let the work of exegesis or Bible study, ferret out what it might mean. So don't jump the gun necessarily. So there's this bromide. I can't remember who said it, but every translator is a traitor. Basically what it means is every translator crosses this line somewhere. And the issue with translations is, do you see more of that than you should, or is the committee, and a good translation is a committee translation because more hands touch it, more people have input, and there's checks and balances. Does the committee come out front and tell you that they're being interpreted? You don't want that. So you want to try to be careful. The gender neutral thing, there are a number of passages where gender neutrality is certainly warranted, but then there are other passages where translators or committees want it to be gender neutral just to reflect the culture. And I think that's a mistake too. I think we need to be real circumspect there. This is why the ESV was born, actually.
Okay.
It was a reaction to gender neutral translations.
Okay. Yeah. People don't understand or appreciate how much effort goes into a translation, and to do a good one is not easy. So, and nobody gets it. Nobody gets it perfect. I mean, I've read the King James sometimes, and I'm like, wow, that was amazing. And other places, I'm like, that's really, and the NIV has a better translation in some cases.
I was weaned and raised on the King James, so. When I was at Logos, one of my jobs was I created a couple reverse interlinears. So I'm probably the only human on the planet. I can confidently say I really am the only human on the planet so far that has had to take every word of the King James and with a software tool, align every word of that translation to the Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek from which it came.
Wow.
Because that's what you have to do when you create these things. So it took me a year. I did both Testaments, and I wanted to do the King James because I felt I kind of owed it something. I wanted to make this tool, and it's very formal equivalent. But there are places in Job that I'll never trust it again. I mean, I have I've been through it segment by segment, and by and large, the King James deserves its reputation. It's a good translation, but there are times when they just struggle. And you can tell that they're struggling and they're kind of winging it, in places. So, but that happens all the time. Even now, it happens.
Oh yeah. Well, that's good. All right. This is from Ruben. He said, I noticed there are differences in some cases between the Septuagint and the Masoretic texts. Do you think the Masoretic texts have been corrupted in some way similar to the modern Bibles? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't even know that I mean, what do you mean by corrupting modern Bibles? You know, because translation is a very difficult enterprise.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the fact of the matter is there is no one biblical text for the Old Testament. I mean, he might be referring to the New Testament, this whole Alexandrian versus Byzantine text family, which is an oversimplification because there's more than two text families for the Greek New Testament. And so people think that, oh, well, the majority text is that's the one that comes right from John the Baptist or something, you know, like, and it's never, you know, there's only one of the. This just isn't true. It's demonstrably untrue, and it's also untrue for the Old Testament. There is no one Masoretic text. I mean, you essentially have three editions. Before 1947, scholars knew that there were essentially three core editions to the Hebrew Bible. One was the Masoretic text, the one of the mainstream Jewish community. The other was whatever was behind the Septuagint, whatever the Septuagint's translators used, because it wasn't the same. You can't understand the Greek in some places from the Hebrew, the Masoretic text, so they must have had a different Hebrew text. And then third is the Samaritan Pentateuch, which is only the first 5 books. After 1947, Dead Sea Scrolls. What they discovered was all three of those traditions are equally as old. There's textual material in the Dead Sea Scrolls for all three of them, and there's textual biblical material for other ones. So they're called unaffiliated texts. So what you have is you have textual plurality or pluriformity from the data that we can't go. That's the wall. The Dead Sea Scrolls are the wall. We can't go back any earlier. So there's a myth that there's this one stream of tradition. So at about 100 AD, the Jewish community gets together. Think about all the English Bibles in a bookstore. Okay, what if somebody walked in there, had the authority, and said, I'm sick of all these English Bibles. We're going to take all of them and just come up with one and burn the other ones. Okay. This is essentially what the Jewish community did in about 100 AD. They said, look, we need to standardize our text. We're going to forbid the use of the Septuagint because those crazy Christians like to use that in places. Samaritan Pentateuch, well, they're going to do their thing on Gerizim. Who gives a rip about them anyway? They're like dying off. Who cares? But for our community, we're going to standardize the text into one text. That's what we know as the Masoretic text. The problem is, a lot of people in the Jewish community didn't like that. So you actually have within the Masoretic tradition differences in manuscripts. These have actually been collected. Okay, if you read German, there's a guy named Aptowitzer who collected all of the variants, the manuscript variants within the Masoretic tradition. It proves beyond any doubt that there is no one Masoretic text. So having said that all as a background, all of these textual traditions have the same problem. There's not just one, and they require comparisons with manuscripts and comparisons against each other. And I think the best rule of thumb is this is what we were taught in grad school, and it's one of the quality things I think they do teach in grad school, is that when it comes to textual criticism, the best manuscript reading is the one that explains how we got all the other ones.
Yes,
and that's really hard to do.
Yeah.
And a good translation committee, they have choices to make. The ESV, NRSV, NLT. I'm sure I'm missing something, but when those translations were created, they made the decision that we're going to go with the Masoretic text, except where we know it's demonstrably incorrect according to the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is why in Deuteronomy 32:8, those translations will read sons of God or angels of God instead of sons of Israel or something like that, because the Dead Sea Scroll evidence it's sons of God. There is no manuscript evidence for sons of Israel that goes back that far. So even as a translation committee, you have to make those decisions. Which text are we going to use? Are we ever going to depart from it? And they try to do work, and this is why you have notes in your study Bible. When it's really difficult, and when interpretation could matter, they'll give you both. The Dead Sea Scrolls say this, Septuagint says that.
Mm-hmm.
This may, they'll do that just to be fair,
Mm-hmm.
to let and give you a flag that there might be a couple different ways you could read this.
That's fantastic. Fantastic. I'm going to kind of segue back to some of the sons of God kind of stuff. This is a question from Ruben, and it's pretty similar to what I was going to ask you. And I have opinions on this, but I want to hear what you have to say. So can you explain the differences between Satan, Lucifer? He's got Gadriel. I don't know that. I don't know if you meant Gabriel, but maybe you know Gabriel, the serpent of old.
That's the guy in the Smurfs. No, that's Gallagher.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. Maybe that was a typo.
Probably a typo.
He says, I'm getting a lot of mixed messages in the text on who is who and what the part is and has been in the timeline. And I would just kind of add to that, obviously from my perspective, this goes back to Ezekiel 28. You've got Isaiah 14. I wanted to ask you also specifically about Enlil as a potential back translation of Halel, but I'll let you start and we'll continue with the conversation.
Yeah, on the Enlil question, there's nothing that I'd have to look at what you're looking at in terms of maybe the literature, but there's nothing that sort of dings a bell that that's a possibility. But who knows? It'd be interesting if it was. But to the former question, the set of questions. Let's do Lucifer first. Lucifer is an artificial term because it comes from the Latin Vulgate. It's the translation of Hallel in Isaiah 14, which means shining one, Hallel ben Shachar, the shining one, the son of the dawn. And so in Latin, that's Lucifer. He's the shining one. So that's where we get that. Mm-hmm. Now, because Lucifer in Christian literature, obviously becomes a term for Satan, then Satan sort of gets retrojected back into Isaiah 14. Now, I personally don't object to that as strenuously as a lot of scholars do. I think, unfortunately, what the Vulgate does there has led scholars to not see things that they should see in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28 because they don't want to look stupid. They don't want to say things like, "Oh, Satan's in Isaiah 14." Well, Satan is never in the passage either. Satan isn't even a term that's used in Genesis 3 of the serpent. So that we have this whole brouhaha. Okay. But that's Lucifer. It's just a translation. So the question about Satan in these passages is, it is quite true that the term Satan is not used in Genesis 3, Isaiah 14, or Ezekiel 28. My response to that is big deal. And the reason I say that is Satan means adversary. Job 1 and 2, Zechariah 3 have Satan in there. That's not the devil either. And we know that because Satan is prefixed in all of the cases, every time it occurs in those passages with a definite article in Hebrew. Satan. Hebrew's like English. English doesn't tolerate a definite article in front of a proper personal name. The Donald Trump is the exception here. Okay? He's the exception that proves the rule. Right? So I'm not the Mike. You're not the Doug. Okay? It's just English doesn't do that, and neither does Hebrew. So when you see the definite article in front of a word like Satan, it tells you this is not a proper personal name. It's not capital S Satan. Rather, it's the adversary, which is a council functionary and all. We don't need to get into that. I do all this in Unseen Realm anyway.
Yeah.
So people will take this and say, well, that, like Satan, big ass Satan of intertestamental period, and especially the New Testament, that's all made up. It comes from Zoroastrianism or something like that. It's like, well, let's slow down here. What do we have in Genesis 3? We have a divine being. It's not just an animal. Genesis 3 isn't about zoology. Okay, we know this is a divine being because, ancient people knew animals didn't talk. You can read other ancient Near Eastern material and it will tell you that when animals talk, the gods are up to something. Okay, so there's a supernatural thing behind this. So they know that. They're not idiots. We know the New Testament tells us that this is, the serpent was the devil, God's great archenemy. So you have a serpent there. You have a supernatural being who opposes God. Okay. Isaiah 14 and Isaiah 28, all scholars recognize that those two passages are quite similar, But what they stop short of is asking, well, are those two passages also similar in vocabulary and trajectories to Genesis 3? And the answer is, yeah, they are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they are.
So I take them all three as drawing on the same idea, the same backstory of a supernatural rebellion
Mm-hmm.
in the divine council, in God's house, as it were, to oppose God. Now, if you look at it that way, as time goes on, sure, you don't have Satan in the Hebrew Bible used of this bad guy. But you know what he is? At the end of the day, he's God's enemy.
Mm.
And so later on, writers think, what would be a good word to call that guy? Satan. He's God's adversary. He's God's enemy. And so the term does eventually get attributed to this figure. And if the shoe fits, make him wear it. Okay.
That's right. Yep.
And so I don't view New Testament Satanology as adversarial, if you'll pardon the pun, to Old Testament theology of the powers of darkness. What we have going on is in the intertestamental period and the New Testament, those people aren't sitting there twiddling their thumbs thinking, man, I got to write something today or I'm going to get a bad grade. I got to make something up. What did Zoroaster say? No, they're looking at their Hebrew Bible and they're seeing the data points of the Hebrew Bible, their sacred text, and they're trying to put the dots together. They're working it. They're doing exegesis. That's all they're doing. And so the data points for the New Testament teaching about Satan, the data points are all in the Old Testament. It's just they're not put together there.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't get all the vocabulary used the way it's going to be used later. But there's actually a very good continuity of thought from Old Testament through Second Temple period to the New Testament. And when My Demons book finally shows up, which is going to be the end of April, I mean, I map all that out, and that's going to be its distinct contribution in academic literature about Satan.
Mm.
Nobody just says point blank, look, all the data points are there. Quit looking for these external, things that pit one testament against the other.
Yeah.
It's not a proper method. So that's the way I look at those things. So we have a vocab issue. We've got a development of an idea issue, but just because an idea develops doesn't mean where it ends is at odds with where it begins. Think of the kingdom of God.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, good grief, if there's development in a doctrine, that would be it. Like the
Right.
rule of God on earth. I mean, well, just because it's over here in the New Testament described this way, does that mean its descriptions conflict
Mm-hmm.
with the Old? No, it doesn't mean that at all.
Yeah.
And that's the
Right.
way we need to look at this whole Satan issue.
Yeah. Just for your reference, I have a friend, Bill Gallagher, who is actually a PhD graduate from the Hebrew University. Go
Mhm.
Hebrew, you. I got a little plug there for my alma mater.
There you go.
He wrote a great paper called On the Identity of Hillel ben Shachar of Isaiah 14. And he says one could reasonably expect Hey Lamed Lamed to be the West Semitic form of Elil, as the Ebla tablets suggest.
Okay.
Elil came into West Semitic directly from Sumerian. Elil's astral function is mentioned in numerous sources. He was a god of 33 stars.
That's important.
Yeah, and I've kind of gone on and done some other work. And so
where do we get the end? Does he say it's assimilation?
Well, so Elil in Akkadian was Enlil in Sumerian.
Right, because you have two L's. The N assimilates into the Lamed.
Correct. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Well, I mean that's certainly a workable trajectory. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'll have to look at it. How do you spell his name?
Here, I'll put this in the comments here. But it's Dr. Bill Gallagher, good guy. So let's see here. There we go. So you can.
It's in Ugarit Forschungen. Okay.
Yeah. So he actually lives in Austria.
I was going to say, which means good luck finding it.
I have the article of at least part of it.
If you can scan it, I'd appreciate it.
Okay, I'll see if I can send it to you.
Okay.
But his work was really helpful for me because I've kind of been following this idea now for probably close to a decade, and it really, I think it makes a tremendous amount of sense. I just did a teaching this past Shabbat on As Above, So Below, and I was talking about the identity of Satan. And I suggest that Isaiah 14 could be understood as Enlil or Elil, if you will, instead of this idea of the bearer of light or something like that. That it's much. It seems to fit better. And when you start to compare what Enlil was all about, he was the god of the something. What was it? Something of the north. I have a whole thing that I put together, but anyway,
is this like cosmic north?
Yeah. So he causes the dawn. He was known as a devastator. He was known among the most prominent members of the Divine Assembly. He was the highest in Mesopotamia until the end of the second millennium, and then he fell into the underworld.
Yeah.
So these are some of the.
That's important too.
Yeah, those are some of the key features. And then, I mean, if you look at the iconography, there you find him on Sumerian cylinder seals, and let's see. I think I can actually share this with you guys. So I don't have to describe it. I can just show you, and that is a little easier. Hold on. Okay, there we go. So you can see here that he is wearing a crown with or a hat with 10 horns coming out of it. And of course, when you compare that with passages in the scripture talking about the 10 horns, so there are many different things that kind of take us to that same basic understanding. So yeah, there's a lot to it.
What you need, you need, I think you do need some astral element because of the language in either place, either passage, Isaiah 14 or Ezekiel 28. You need council membership, you need rebellion, you need punishment, so that sounds real promising.
Yeah, he definitely rebelled. There's no question about that. He had the Tablet of Destinies. He replaced An or Anu as the go-to god. He was known as the god of the air. And it's incredible when you start looking at all of these things. He's also called the Kurgal, which is the great mountain, and so many other passages that speak of these different similarities. So yeah, really interesting stuff. Yeah, it's pretty cool. That's really cool. So
are you still in contact with him as an author or as a friend or?
Yeah, as a friend. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. We talk every so often. Okay. And so I think he hasn't been doing as much scholarly writing as he used to, but comes and goes, and so
sure.
Yeah. So I'm kind of working on a book as well, and I'm going to talk about the origin of Satan and such, and so that's good stuff.
It is good stuff.
Yeah, I appreciate what you're working on there. We've got a few more questions. Let's see if I can get to just a couple. Let's see here. One person had a question about the Aramaic Targumim. What are your thoughts on the Aramaic Targumim?
I think they have some importance for. Generally, there are some New Testament passages that I think really matter as far as the either allusion to or use of the Targumim. I think the issue with the Memra is probably the most important, at least that pops into my head, because there's actually a book on this. John Ronning, Ronning, wrote a book. It's published by Hendrickson. On the Logos and the Memra. I can't remember exactly what the title is. I could probably look it up here while you're talking about something else. But
sure.
But it's basically how John's. This is going to sound crazy. How John's Logos theology is not dependent on Philo.
Okay. That's important.
Actually, it's actually rooted in the Old Testament and the Targums.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that would seem to matter. I don't think John is looking to Platonic philosophy in his Logos category. This seems to be a much more fruitful trajectory. And again, having read a good bit about the Memra, I would agree. So I think for that at least, they're really important. But there are other places where they're going to contribute things too that John and other New Testament writers might have been tracking on something in one of the Targums, as opposed to the Septuagint or something.
A really interesting one is in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, where Paul talks about that they all ate the same spiritual bread and they drank the same spiritual drink
Mm-hmm.
from the rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting. There is in the Targumim, there is a very clear um, interpretation, if you will, that is talking about either the rock or the stream that actually followed them through the wilderness. And
Mm-hmm.
that's, to my knowledge, that's the only place that we find that. And
Mm-hmm.
I would suggest that that's probably where Paul is getting that
Yeah,
that idea.
yeah. If there's really no other point of orientation, those are usually those kind of indicators. Not with respect to the Targumim, but in Hebrews 1, the use of the term apagasma, the radiance, of the image and all that stuff. I mean, that only occurs one other time in Greek literature, and that's it's one of the apocryphal books, in the Septuagint. So, when you have something like that, that's the only place you can really find that. Chances are pretty good. That's what they're tracking on.
Right. Yeah. This is a question from Clayton. He asks, I just put it on the screen. He says, "Where are these gods today, and how physically active with the people were they in charge of at Babel in Deuteronomy 32?"
Yeah, that was going to be my question back. Are we talking about the Deuteronomy 32 worldview here? These are the fallen, if we want to say it this way, the fallen sons of God, the fallen Elohim over the nations. Paul's language, Paul in half a dozen passages will equate the defeat or nullification, the stripping off, is one phrase Paul uses, of the gods. Their ruling authority is removed. It's nullified at the resurrection and the ascension. And that becomes really important for Paul's mission to the Gentiles, because they had the same theology in their own classical Greek writings, that we worship the gods we do because they're assigned to us. And so Paul would go into a Gentile town and say, "Look, I get it, fellows. You think you're supposed to worship these gods, and if you reject them, you're going to be in big trouble. But I have news for you. It's the Most High. It's the God of Israel who is the Most High, who set this all up. And he became a man, died for you on the cross, rose from the dead, ascended to the right hand of the Father, and now covets your return to him." So you ask, well, where are they still? Well, their authority has been nullified and removed. They don't have authority over the Gentile nations anymore. There's no obligation here.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean that they're going to like take their ball and go home. To them, I think that we have every indication, because Paul says we're still at war, with these entities.
Right.
They still oppose us. And so what they're doing is they're not taking the ball and going home. They're fighting for their turf. And I think one important element of this is that Paul links the return of the Lord and the end of days to the, quote, fullness of the Gentiles. This time, and again, only God knows when this condition is met, but when the Gentiles are regathered, whatever that means, and then Israel, that's a trigger to Israel's awakening and the re-engrafting and all that stuff, because all those things are associated with the end of days. And so if I were a principality, I would be thinking thoughts like, I know who God is. I know he's the Most High. I don't really like him. Okay. And I know I can't beat him, but you know what I can do? I can kick this can down the road. I can prevent people in the nations over which I once had authority, and I still want my authority. I still think of them as mine. I'm going to keep them from rejoining Yahweh's family for as long as I can, and extend my own existence, because I know I'm under judgment. Psalm 82, Isaiah 34, Isaiah 24. Okay. I'm under judgment, but I can forestall that because silly Yahweh has connected the return of the Messiah to the Gentile conversion. So it's my job now to make sure that just doesn't happen. So that's what they're doing. What they're doing is they're getting in the way of the Great Commission. What they're doing is they're sowing chaos among their populations, just like they've always done. Anything they can do to confuse people, to enslave the thinking of people, to reject God's invitation to come back home. That's what they're going to do. And I think there's a finite number of these. And again, my thinking there is based on the fact that the myriads upon myriads language that you get of the heavenly host in the Bible, it's never used of the bad guys. It's only used of the good guys. And so I think there's a finite number of these. And so I think the inclination is to work smart and not hard. The principalities and powers, this is Daniel 2. This is Deuteronomy 32. We have Daniel 10, where we have empires that are actually under the influence of supernatural beings. And so how do you do that? Do you need to possess everybody? Do you need to turn every person in the land into a sock puppet or a flesh puppet? No, you don't need to do that. What you need to do is you need to control power structures. You need to control empire. You need to have an influence over the way the leadership thinks. You need to influence thinking, because as people think, they will behave. They will do things based upon what they believe.
Yep.
And so this is how it's done. This is how you work smart and not hard. You move the herd from A to B. It's a simple prescription, but it's at a scale that's, we can today kind of appreciate how this is done because we do have truly mass media, like with the internet. We have things, we have technologies now that cover a large swath of the planet in a couple seconds. I mean, we understand a little bit more now about how this conceptually can work. And I think that intelligent evil, this is what they do. We control the power structures and the thinking of our populations, thereby enslaving them and extending our own existence.
You suggested that Satan says maybe he believes he can't win, but maybe he can kick the can down the road. Do you think that there could be maybe a sense that he thinks that, okay, I can't beat God, like I can't out arm wrestle God,
right,
but I could maybe have a tie? That's kind of my thinking.
Well, what I just described is a tie. I mean,
okay,
because the eschatological judgment in their mind, that can be forestalled,
like indefinitely, essentially.
All right. Yes, in their thinking, I think that they're thinking that.
Okay.
Now the wild card here is that only God knows when the conditions for His plan are met. They don't know that. He does. So I hate to bring up the TV show Stranger Things, but since I just did a book on Stranger Things, finding the gospel of Stranger Things.
Okay.
But I actually think that the concept of the show, for those of you who are listening, that are familiar with this, I think the concept of the hive mind here is actually a good illustration, because in the show you have creatures and you have the Satan figure, and they all function collectively as a hive mind, and it creates the impression that this is an unbeatable thing. But the hive mind is actually its greatest weakness, because intelligent evil, again, all the forces that at least have the same enemy, and that is God and his family. They may see something and never forget. They may have sort of an inexhaustible memory, but they cannot anticipate thoughts and actions that are outside the collective. They can't do it by definition, because they are not omniscient. There's only one omniscient being.
Yep.
And that's their adversary. That's the one they're trying to beat or tie.
Right.
And so, yes, in their mind, I think that they think they can play this game indefinitely.
Okay.
But they are going to be outflanked at some point by the greater mind, who can see how all the pieces not only will, but could fit together and will work to those ends. I sort of back end sovereignty in things. I'm not a front end, hyper Calvinist sovereignty guy. I'm a back end sovereignty guy that God will use. He doesn't need to change free agency and free will to win. He will work the plan. He will get his way, one way or the other.
Yep. Yeah, that's the incredible thing about God, is that He can take all of the variables, free will choices that we all can make, and He can still work those into His plan.
What's more impressive? If we use the chess analogy, if I'm God and I sit down in front of you and I say, "Hey, Doug, we're going to play chess today, and I just want you to know you're going to lose because I predestinated all your moves." Okay, that might sound impressive, but it's more impressive if I sit down and say, "Hey, Doug, we're going to play chess today, and you're going to lose, and you can move wherever you want. I'm just that good."
Yeah.
You can't beat me. Do what
Beating
you
me
want.
wouldn't be that impressive.
Right.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, I'm actually working on a movie script along those lines. It's kind of the Book of Revelation meets the Matrix, and so
That's not the title, though, right?
no, that's not the title. But I want it to be an end times trilogy, and what we're looking at doing for the image of the beast is sort of that hive mind swarm mentality.
Mhm.
That when you join this thing, you become part of the swarm, and it seems like it's a great idea at first,
Yeah.
but of course it turns out to be a very bad idea. It's
Yeah.
sort of Saruman, who has the one ring to rule them all, is essentially Satan, who gets to
Mhm.
rule everybody. But
And see, that's another wonderful analogy, because when Saruman sees, he remembers,
mm,
but he can't see everything.
hmm
So you've the collective looks like this unbeatable thing,
hmm
this unbeatable collective, but what it is actually the thing that undermines, its ability to win. Because, and this is how life is. This is the unseen hand. This is providence.
hmm
There is only one being who sees all possible combinations.
Yep. Yep.
By definition. So you might be really, really, really smart and never forget a thing.
Yeah.
But if you're not that being over there, you are still
Yep.
outflanked.
Totally. Yeah. And I think that's exactly what Satan is. I mean, he is the ultimate genius who can see, 1,000 moves in advance or whatever, but he can't see all the moves, right?
Right.
And
You
God can
can't
see
see
all
all
the
the
moves.
moves.
Right.
Yep.
Yep. So, well, thank you. This has really been a pleasure to have you on.
Yeah, absolutely.
And thank you so much. There's so much we could have gone into, but time does not allow it. So again, appreciate you coming on. I want to encourage everyone to go check out his books. You can go to Dr. Michael S. Heiser's page on Amazon.com. You can check out The Unseen Realm that we talked about a little bit today. You can check out Angels, what the Bible really says about God's heavenly host. Supernatural, what the Bible teaches about the unseen realm. And Reversing Hermon, which would have been a lot of fun, but Enoch the Watchers and the Forgotten Mission of Jesus Christ. Demons, what does God want, and others. And so so many good, exciting things, and I think
They're exciting to us anyway.
well, they're exciting to some people, right?
Well, I should say, to be fair, Unseen Realm, I mean, it now has over 1,000 reviews on Amazon, and it's still, it'll still show 5 stars. It's like 4.8 or something like that, 4.9. But what that tells you is that there are a lot of people, the book has touched a nerve. There are a lot of people everywhere who care about biblical theology, and they haven't quit. They might be in a church or in some other circumstance where they just feel like they're not being taught, but they're still hungry. They haven't bagged it. And so that's why we, you and I mean, that's why we do what we do, because we know you're out there. We just have to find you and help get you content.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, again, thank you so much. Everyone stay in the Word, because there's great stuff in there. And if you don't understand, check out Dr. Heiser's stuff. There are answers to your questions. And ultimately, we want to know and love our Lord and be about his business. Till next time, God bless.